Who was like JP and was not very good at art? Yeah, like half the room. I just think you just go on Google now and copy, image and paste. That's the way to do it. I can't draw at all. Anyway, so the last 2 weeks I've been talking about a particular topic and really honing in on folk, of course not talking about you, who think they're better than they are. That's obviously not you. But people who think they are better than they are or who feel superior to others. And we were talking about humility, really. And most data and studies suggest that most people feel superior to others a lot of the time. But what I want to do today is round off this series with the other end of the spectrum, like JP might have sort of given a hint to. And that is that when we think or feel not good enough. When we think or feel, or sometimes both, not good enough. Whether that's for God, or for other people, or for me, you know, when you think about it for yourself, just your own standard, that it's just not good enough. Either in a specific area, like honing in really down on one thing that's important to you, that you value highly, or just has always hit you around the head all the time, or you don't feel good enough, all the way to like an overarching sort of view of this, of not feeling good enough in any regard. And I want to be clear, I'm really talking about when that comes with a healthy, or should I say, unhealthy dose of negativity. That's what I want to talk about today. I don't want to talk about the people in the room who are perhaps wired like me and my son. I talked to Joel about this the other day, about how often, even if we excel at something, for us, sometimes we just don't feel good enough. I want to be better at it. It's just not quite cutting it. I want to do more, be better for me, for everyone, but not with a dose of negativity. Just that drive of wanting to be better at a particular thing. And so I'm really talking about when it comes with that dose of negativity, of not actually feeling good enough. When you build a stage and it's not quite good enough. I think I done this bit just here. Me and Angie probably done this bit here. Have to get Tony on it. He's definitely good enough at the carpentry. Me, not so much. But I want to talk about in every regard in your life, because some things in the natural, some things that feel small can actually grow into something very big. And I want to talk all the way up to the biggest things in our life. But maybe like, for instance, when you fail a test. Has anyone ever failed a test? I don't know what that feels like, never failed a test. Liar. When you fail a test and you can think, oh, I'm just not good enough in that area. Or you get an annual review at work. Oh, see, some of your bosses, you know, they're harsh and you come away feeling like, oh, I've just been beaten around the head and I don't feel good enough in any regard. Other people have got soft, agreeable bosses who would never say anything negative to you to your face. And so you come away thinking you're brilliant at everything and they're thinking, oh, he's rubbish. But sometimes we come away from them instances feeling not good enough. Maybe the boss comes away thinking, I'm not a good enough boss because I can't be direct and get the best out of my employees. Maybe you've asked the girl out and she said no, and you feel not good enough in any regard for any woman forever, for the rest of your life. Because it's hard when you're told that you're not good enough. When you act like with a test, it's like, here's the level. You didn't make it. We are telling you, even with like marks, either with numbers or letters, you know, when you have an F, they might as well just say, not good enough, and give it back to you. When you're told you're not good enough, when you actually hear it by rejection or someone telling you it, it's really hard to hear. It's not nice to hear. And so it's maybe that sort of stuff. Or maybe it's more sort of a grey area, maybe a softer approach where someone's just critical of you. And maybe you grew up in a household where a parent or both parents or someone who was of value to you criticized and pointed out your flaws regularly, and they were wired that way to see the negative in everything. And you brought up in that sort of environment where you just never felt good enough for that person, whether that's a parent or maybe now it could even be a spouse who's someone who just picks on things all the time and that's all you hear and all you feel. Maybe it's a boss who's like that. And you think to yourself or feel that I'm not good enough. Or maybe separate to other people. Maybe you've just messed up in a big way. You made a huge mistake back in the day, and it's just carried with you the whole time, and you've never felt good enough, whether that's letting somebody down, it did involve someone else, or just in yourself, or maybe from God's regard, a sin in the past that was so massive that it had a destructive element in your world, and it haunts you still, and maybe you're dealing with the ramifications of that sin all the time, and so you bring with that a feeling of guilt, but also a feeling of not being good enough. So I want to talk about everything in between as well. So I think we've covered most people in the room who might have felt this at some point. And some people might feel this a lot of the time, others maybe just occasionally through their life, but it has a real impact when it comes and sneaks up on you because you're not used to dealing with it. And so I want to look at this dude in the Old Testament who was plagued with inadequacy. It's like running through every part of every story, it seems, and he felt not good enough, and that was Moses. I want to talk about, we could have gone the strong route of Gideon, done that before. But I want to talk about Moses because it's more complex. There's more information and data there that we can pull out and drag and look from different sides. I want to look at this dude who, most of us know who Moses is in the room. And he was born under Egyptian rule, so the Israelite people, under Joseph. It was great. He was the second in command and like the prime minister, if you like, of the area. But then, and all his family and people were doing really well. But over time, over hundreds of years, the dynamics changed and the politics changed, and suddenly the Israelites were slaves under the Egyptians. And so it's a very different dynamic here. And Pharaoh, who was in charge of Egypt, king of Egypt, was like, there's getting too many of his Israelites. They're just like cockroaches in his mind, like they were lesser people. There's too many of them. I want to exterminate them. And so what he done was divide a decree out and say, we're going to kill all the little baby boys. As soon as they come along, want to kill all the little baby boys because he was terrified of a resistance coming from the bottom and overthrowing him. I think that must have been the psychology behind it. And so we know the story of little Moses coming along from a Levite woman, husband and wife, and she puts him in a basket and sends him down the river and watching from afar, sister watching from, make sure not eaten by an alligator or anything like that. What a terrible thing to have to do. It's amazing, we like tuck them in car seats and make sure they're warm and put little hats on them just in case they get cold. Imagine a mother just putting a baby in a river and pushing it downstream. It's unbearable to think about, but this is what happened. And so the Egyptian princess, if you like, finds Moses in the river. We know the story, most of us, and basically raises him as her own, if you like, in that culture. But it seems that Moses always knew that he was from a different people, but perhaps this is where the root of Moses' feeling of inadequacy came from, perhaps. That's a difficult thing to comprehend and understand, especially if you didn't know the details about it, of being sort of rejected or pushed away down a river from your own mother and father, even though the intentions were right and good. Perhaps that's the root of some of his feeling of not being good enough, even though they're completely not founded in anything real. But he was abandoned from an early age, and maybe some of you can relate to that feeling. But he grew up, and when he was grown up, Moses was out and he saw an Egyptian basically beating up the Hebrew slave who was contracted, is probably too strong a word, but he was made to make bricks. They were all made to make bricks for the building work in Egypt, and he come across this Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave, and he knew, it says in Scripture, it was his people. It was one of his own people, and so what Moses done was something bubbled up inside of him, that injustice, and he actually attacks the Egyptian and kills him. And you can imagine he's killed this, and he's right in the middle. He's like, I've been raised Egyptian, I've got all these people on this side, I've got my people who I love who are on this side, I've just killed this dude, and he panics and he buries the guy in the sand. And he's like, yeah, that's great, Moses, until a windy day. Put a patio over it. I've seen Coronation Street and all them Emmerdale, and that's how they do it. And so, but he kills him, and the next day it says that Moses went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. His own people were fighting these two blokes. And he basically went to the one who started it, who was the bully of the situation, and he rebuked the guy and said, what are you doing? Stop doing this. And the guy said to him, and I love it, completely undermines Moses' self of worth and who he is. He says to Moses, he says, who made you ruler and judge over us? And I can feel it in the text of him just being like, yeah, you're right. Who has? Who? It's like someone in the town centre in Thetford, when you do something or say something or look at someone and they go, who are you? That's what he was doing. Who are you? What authority do you have? You are nobody. You ain't good enough to tell me what to do, even though he probably was. In fact, he was probably trained up to, that was his job to go and do. It's likely that that was the case. And who made you ruler and judge over us? And then he said, are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? And the panic in Moses, because he obviously thought he'd got away with it, and he panicked, and word got out, and Pharaoh found out, and then Pharaoh decided he was going to try and kill Moses, so Moses ran away. And so he ran away and into the wilderness, if you like, but he settles down and meets a nice lady and gets a job as a shepherd. But one day, bumps into God. He's just out, and God's just being God around, just being a bush over here, been a bush over here, going to burn this one, talk to somebody. God's being God, doing his thing. And Moses bumps into God on his travels, and God's inhabited this flaming bush to come and talk to Moses. And we pick up the story there. And what God's doing is he sets him on his mission. He's saying, this is what I want you to do. I'm giving you this mission to go and do. And even it's the mission that God designed him for. I want you to think about this. God's out of time. He knows everything that's going to happen. He's like, I'm going to raise this guy up, Moses. All his background's really messed up, but I'm going to use this guy. I've built him to spec. I've built this guy to spec to do the thing that I need him to do. And so he approaches Moses and said, this is what I want to do. I'm sending you on a mission. So let's pick it up. Exodus 3 from verse 10. We're going to jump around a little bit. It says this, so now go. He's just told him everything he's supposed to do. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And it says this in verse 11. But Moses said to God, I'm like, that's your first mistake there, Moses. It's like God's giving you a direction. He's giving you this command. He's giving you this thing. And you're saying, excuse me, but... I love that. But Moses says to God, he resists God and says, check this question out. Who am I? Who am I to do that? I ain't good enough to do that. Pharaoh's up here. I ain't good enough to do that. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? You can see this mentality in Moses early on of not feeling good enough, rejected by mother. He's come to help his Hebrew friend who are fighting, and they said, who are you? No one's put you in charge. You go away. He's come along to God, and God's reaffirmed him and said, this is who you are, and he still feels, who am I that I can go to someone who's high up? I am not good enough. Who am I? And God says, don't worry, mate. I'll be with you. It's cool. I'm coming. And I think when there's times when we don't feel good enough in an area of life, or either a specific area or just overarching, where I think when we don't feel good enough, we just need to shut up sometimes and just listen to God. And listen to what God says about us in that area. And so he gives Moses instructions. He gives him very detailed instructions of what to do. And I'm like, you're lucky, Moses. We don't hardly ever get detailed instructions. We get like a little soggy manual that's got some pages missing, and we just have to trust. But you're like, he's like, do exactly this thing. You might as well have made him a map, done Google Maps, typed it in for him. There he is. Done you a schedule, Moses, on day one, right? He'd given all this information. Go to the elders, do this thing. I want you to go to the elders of the Israelites, of the Hebrew people. Go to the elders and go and talk to them and tell them what I'm telling you. And so we'll jump down to Exodus 4, verse 1. He then says, Moses answered, oh, here he goes again. He said, what if they do not believe me? What if they don't believe me or listen to me or say the Lord did not appear to you? You see how suddenly he's been worried about what he feels about himself and what Pharaoh might think about him, but now he's worried about if he's good enough in the eyes of other people, his own people, the people who are sort of on his level, who are his people. He's worried that he's not good enough in the eyes of other people. You can understand not feeling good enough in the eyes of a king or a pharaoh. You might think that if you met a famous person who you think's amazing, you might think, oh, I'm rubbish compared to you. You might feel that, but like the normal people, the people in your world, and they're just elders in the group, the people who are leaders in the group, he didn't feel good enough. He's not good enough in other people's eyes. And God then reassures Moses, and I love this. He's like, okay, because he knows Moses. He's already got this planned out. He says, I'll perform loads of miracles for you and with you. He's like, and I'm going to, he's like, what's in your hand? And Moses is like, well, this staff. He's like, I'm a shepherd. I like poking the sheep with it when they won't do what they're told. And he's like, right, we'll use that. I'll use what you've got in your hand. We're going to do some miracle stuff. We're going to show, you're going to throw it down, it comes a snake, and then it'll turn back, and then everyone will be like, wow. And then you're going to put your arm in your cloak, and it's going to come out leprosy-like, and then you're going to put it away and come back, and it's going to be healed. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be like, we could take this show to Vegas, God's going. And so, maybe not. But Moses was like, okay, you're telling me to do these things, and it's going to be da-da, it's going to be amazing, they're going to be thrilled. But then Moses then goes deeper further. Exodus 4, jump down to verse 10, please, it says this. But Moses said to the Lord, and he's polite, you've got to give him, he's very polite. Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. Like even when we're chatting now, he's saying, I can't even talk with you now. I'm finding this difficult. It says, I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said to him, I love this way, that God just like comes in and takes his excuse out from under his feet. And it's like, he says, who gave human beings their mouth? He's saying, I made your mouth. I made how you speak. I'm telling you what to do, and you're giving me an excuse about the specifications of the build that you made. That's like a vase, like leaning back on the table, saying to the potter, what are you doing? I can't hold flowers. Like, give me a handle or something. And the potter, you know, that would scare a potter, because obviously clay doesn't talk. But it's the same thing, and he says, who gave human beings their mouth? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? And he's like, now go, and I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. He's saying, you feel not good enough in this area, but I've designed you perfectly for the job that I've made you to do. You don't feel good enough. You're telling me them things you're not good enough in, and I'm saying that's cool. The level you are with that, I can still use you, and I will help you in that area. God's saying, like, look, dude, I love this. God didn't say you're perfect, Moses. He didn't say you're perfect in every regard. He didn't say that. He said, but you are good enough. You are good enough to do the thing that I've called you to do. You might not be perfect compared to what you think of other people, but you are good enough. I know because I made you. Now I'm telling you what I made you for. So shut up, get up, and go. And this is like the tone of what God's saying. I'm not sure God would tell him to shut up. Maybe he would. He does say close your mouth quite a lot. In Exodus 4, let's jump down to verse 13, I think it is, Kaylee. I might have written that down wrong. Let's see if we can get it right. It says, but Moses said, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Is that where we are? Yeah. And check the tonal change the text brings out. It says, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. He's like, every excuse you come up with why you're not good enough, I've given you the reasons why it's okay. And you're saying now, I want you to, even though you're doing all that, I want you to use somebody else. And the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And we don't know if he felt that. I don't know if the bush got hotter, you know, and scared Moses. We don't know, but it says that God says, what about your brother, Aaron, or Aaron for your Americans, the Levite? I know he can speak well. He said, your brothers here, your older brothers here, don't worry, like baby Moses, don't worry, your big brother's here. God's reassuring him. He said, what about your brother? He speaks really well. He's already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. He's like, I'm going to use you as a conduit just for Aaron to speak. And notice God didn't ask that to start with. He said, I'll help you do it. And because he refused, he's like, oh, okay, I'll use your brother. Is that all right? Make you feel better? Because you're terrified of public speaking. I'm still going to use you for the thing that I've designed you for. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it. And so, like 4 times, Moses was chatting back to God, saying, I ain't good enough for this. You're telling me to do this thing, and I do not feel good enough. And we could understand maybe all the reasons why he felt like that. But he said, I'm not good enough. And I think firstly this morning, sometimes we just need to accept that we are good enough. And depending how you're wired in here, sometimes you might feel that more difficult than other people. to accept that we are good enough. Sometimes we just need to accept it. Like Moses finally went, okay, that's cool. It's great. And that was God being firm. That was like grumpy dad with him. You know, you'll do what you're told. Okay, yeah. But he come to the point where he accepted that he was good enough to do the thing that God had asked him to do. You know, when I think about when I took on the church with Steph years and years ago, we'll be really frank, we didn't feel good enough. It was like, this is what we've been asked to do. Felt like we've been called to do from a spiritual point of view, but from a natural point of view with actual people asking us to do it as well. It was like, we don't feel good enough to do this. We're not equipped. We haven't got the skill set, that we ain't good enough. And can I tell you, we both still pretty much feel exactly the same today, years and years later. We still don't feel good enough. We don't feel good enough. And I've got 4 children now, and some of you parents in the room, maybe some of you are new, we've got new parents to be as well. You know, the first few years of having a child, Joel was our first. He's 11 years old now, and the difficulty that come with that transition of life, right? From none to one is like being hit by a train, and then every subsequent child is like a smaller, lesser train force, because it's just a completely different dynamic change in your life. You know, it's all new stuff to you, and lots of difficulty that came with that. And quite often, you'd feel like, I'm not good enough to do this job. I'm suddenly a parent, and I don't feel good enough to be a parent. You know, especially me, I grew up without a dad in the home. I had no template to copy and paste. I had nothing to learn off. Anything I could have learned off was pretty bad. And so it's like, I don't know if I'm good enough for this. I don't feel good enough. I'm sort of muddling my way through as I go, making lots of mistakes and trying to learn on the way. And often Steph would feel that. You know, as a mother of 4, as get less and less time and less energy, it's like often that feeling of, I just don't feel good enough for that. And what we've learned is that, and what we've come to accept and learn is not only were we good enough or are we good enough from 1 to 4, is that we were purposed for it. We were designed for that job. We're the perfect parent. I know you don't agree with me, Joel, but I'm the perfect dad for you. He's like, no, you're not. Because he's got a list of my flaws. He's got all the good stuff on me, and I have on him. Because we're both imperfect. We're all imperfect people, but God designed us as cogs to fit together, to say, you might not feel good enough for that, but that is what I've designed you for. Exactly. You are the best for that. And so, and I know there's some grey areas around that we go into, but we'll avoid that today. But so how we felt or how we feel sometimes, it's just how we felt. It's just how we feel. And so it has no bearing on reality. And so I asked the question, where in life do you not feel good enough? And do you just need to, like Moses, listen to God and catch up and understand that you are good enough? Are there areas of your life where you just need to do that? There was a slide that I was going to use that had the question, am I good enough? And I think we resist asking the question sometimes, or really exploring this when we don't feel good enough. Maybe you do need to get to a point like Moses and just ascertain and accept and understand, I am good enough. But to get there, we have to actually ask the question and delve into it. And maybe some of us resist doing that for a very good reason, because sometimes we are not good enough. And let me explain before you cry. Sometimes we are not good enough. What do I mean? What I mean is we're not just not feel good enough. I mean that we're actually not good enough. And I put it to you, as hard as it is to know that or feel that, and hard as it is, it can be sometimes, we must accept that we are not good enough right now. And that's a difficult thing to accept sometimes, that to accept that we are not good enough right now. And it's not just that we feel it, we actually can measure it. It's a reality. We're not good enough for that thing that we're supposed to be doing, or that we've been called to do, or God's asking us to do, or being a dad, being a mum, whatever it is, that in a metric that we know we can measure. And it's not just how we feel about something, but we know that we're not. And it's not just a feeling, that sometimes we just have to accept we're not good enough right now. And what I mean is, in an area that we need to improve, to be able to fulfill what God has called us to do in our life, whatever that looks like. I'm not talking about just within the church. I'm talking about in every area of your life. There'll be areas where you're not good enough right now for what you're required to do in the future. And what just feeling not good enough, what that can do is paralyze you from ever growing into that. Because you feel so bad and depressed about, I'm not as good as I need to be or should be or is expected of me, that you go inward and actually close down everything that could lead you to being the thing that you even want to be. Because after all, we're all called to change from one degree of glory to the next. As a follower of Christ, we should be transformed by the renewing of our mind, becoming more into the likeness of Christ. As time goes on, we should become more like Jesus, hopefully. That would be the plan. And what that effectively would mean is, like, when you're up here and you're more like Jesus, at that point, you weren't as much like Jesus. And so maybe you're not quite as good as you should be in that area. And we'll get into the details of that in a moment before you build a theology on that. Because years later, in the wilderness, Moses was acting as leader. He was the leader of his people. And he was, they'd had a hard time. You just read all of Exodus. It's like, you just think, oh, bless them. And then you think, oh, you're idiots. And then you think, oh, bless them, you're idiots. But he was in the wilderness and he was acting, if you like, he was the leader, but he was acting as the local council. He was acting as central government. He was acting as judge, jury, and executioner. He was, the long and short of it, he was in authority over every sort of thing that was going on. Every problem, they brought it to him. And the way he was governing, the way he was leading in governance over these millions of people simply was just not good enough. It just wasn't good enough. And it took someone to come and tell him. Exodus 18, verse 14, I think we are. It says this: when his father-in-law, so father-in-law shows up on a holiday visit, father-in-law comes along and saw all that Moses was doing for the people. He said, what is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? Because it happens every day, all these problems. Imagine the little problems you get in your workplace, your boss has to deal with. Imagine that magnified by like 10,000 times, and there's only one person who deals with it all. It says this: whenever, it says, Moses answered him, because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions. And check this. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, replied, what you are doing is not good. Oh, what, you need a father-in-law or a mate in your world or a wife who will say, that ain't good enough. Who can actually point out when you're operating in a way that doesn't meet the standard, not in some sort of moral sense, but like the way you're doing things is not good enough for what it needs to be for us to get to the place we're going. We need someone like a father-in-law who can just be straight. It's always great to have a disagreeable friend who tells you exactly what they think. Doesn't feel nice, but it's good. See, the disagreeable ones are nudging them, going, see, told you. What you're doing is not good. And it says in verse 18, you and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. Check this. What an insult. The work is too heavy for you. Yes, you, Moses, who've done all these amazing things. That work, the way you're operating, is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. You're not good enough, mate. As brilliant as you think you are, you ain't good enough to do that. And he says this, and this is an important word, listen. Listen now to me. And I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God. He's saying, yeah, sure, you must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. That's your job. That's your role. But, he says, verse 20, teach them his decrees and instructions and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. And he says this, I like this, verse 21, but select capable men from all the people. So he's setting up some sort of governance system here. Jethro's saying to Moses, the way you're doing it is not good enough. We're going to do a better way. And he says, select capable men from all the people. Well, what's that? That's a system, a meritocracy of saying there's merit. There's some people who will not be good enough to do this job. There are some people who are good enough to do this job, and you as Moses as leader have got to select from them people. So even Jethro was saying some people ain't good enough to do this little role that you're going to give them. Select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, over hundreds, 50s and 10s. The ones over 10s may not be as good in that realm as the people who are over hundreds and thousands. He says this, have them serve as judges for the people at all times. And then he says this, but have them bring every difficult case to you. He's like, you're still the boss and in charge, Moses. You're still playing your role, but you're going to do it in a way that's better. The simple cases they can decide themselves. They will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain. And all these people will go home satisfied. He's like, if you can improve in this way, everybody wins. Absolutely everybody in your community wins if you get better at doing this thing that you're not quite good enough at the moment in the big purpose that God's called you to is leading his people. Moses, I love this, verse 24. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He listened. You know, when there's critical stuff coming to you, when you're reviewed at work, when your wife says that, whenever, you know, you've got to enter into that and think, is this just rubbish? And is it just, I feel not good enough? And God's like, no, you're not. You are good enough. Or is it that there's areas of my life that people are pointing out, and rightly so, saying, here's the standard. Come up to it because God needs you to be able to do the thing that he's called you to do. Simply what Moses was doing wasn't good enough at that time. But I want you to think about this, but was within his ability. It's not like I'm not good enough, ever go home and sulk. It was within his ability. He just had to change some things. He just had to improve. He had to learn. He had to listen for a better outcome for everyone. And I like this. Notice that God didn't tell him. Because God could at some point come, what are you doing, Moses? And come in like a tree this time, with flowers. He could have done anything he wanted to, but he didn't. He let Jethro do it. He let someone else outside come and tell him. And it shows you something about Moses. And maybe because he was humble, maybe that humility that he had was rooted in inadequacy to start with, where he felt inadequate. But maybe he grew into someone who was actually humble, rather than just low self-esteem, which is not good, but someone who was humble. And it says in some part of Scripture that at the time, Moses was the most humble person in the whole of the country, in the whole of the land. And so his father-in-law said, hey, not good enough, sort it out. And we all know people like that who say, not good enough. And we can either sit there and stew in the fact that we're not good enough, even in the area, I want you to think about this, even in the area God's purposed you in and called you in. We can just stew on that and go inward and depressed and hate ourselves about it and feel not good enough. Or we can be like Moses and listen and grow. Just like when you take, let's do it in the natural, when you take a driving test, right? Any first-time passers? Hands up, yeah. Any second time? Third? Fourth? Any fifths? Fifth seems to be the level. I think when you get to 5, they just go, you know what? You've tried well hard. Have it. Some people try again, and driving's never their thing. They never meet the standard. And do I, as another road user, go, oh, just let them have it? You go, no. They're not good enough to drive. And maybe they are. Maybe they just can't do the pressure of the test. But my point being is that what we don't do is just go inward and be depressed about that. And maybe some people do for a while, but I'm saying maybe that's not the right response to this definite, it's really cut and dry, isn't it? It's like you got this many points or faults or whatever they call them now. You're too dangerous, you can't drive. It's like, no, not good enough. And what we do is we go away and we improve, and we try and improve, and we come back to see if we meet the standard. And yet in so many areas of our life that are entwined with emotion and relationships, we don't do that. When it's pointed out or you just understand and accept I'm not good enough in that area, we give up instead of deciding to improve and push on, because maybe Moses could have just carried on, put his head down, and I think he'd have very different results. When I think about my life, about this, about where I just wasn't good enough and I needed to improve. You know, when I was in school, in high school, I was pretty academic. I liked school, I liked learning, I still do. And so like most of my subjects, and I know some of you hate me for this, but I didn't really have to do any studying or revision or even try. Particularly in the English was different. I'm not particularly great with the reading, but the maths and the science, all them sort of things just came naturally. In science, I could just listen. Didn't take notes, even at A-level. Didn't listen. I didn't write any notes. I just listened. That's all I did. And I had the sort of brain, can't do it anymore, 4 kids later, but I could just take information in. And in maths, I was very similar at GCSE level. I'm like, this is easy. I'm like, my brain is a maths brain, so I just don't have to try. And then I hit A-level maths. And I was like, initially, I was like, I can do this. So I didn't show up to many of my lectures. You didn't hear that, Joel. I didn't revise. This was my revision. I read the back of the textbook on the way to my A-level exam, on the bus. That's what I'd done. And I was thinking, everything in my past said I can do this, because I've got away with it so many times. Why waste energy and effort when I could be playing rugby or seeing friends? Why waste it? That's inefficient. That's how I felt. And then I got my result back, and I was like, E! That's one before an F. For those of you who aren't very good with letters, well, I suppose it's after, depending on which way you're looking at it. But I was like, an E? I hadn't ever had an E in my life, and technically at A-level at that time, that was a pass. But it wasn't a pass to me. That was like, no, I can't do that. I'm not even going to show my mum that. I don't want to tell my friends that. But when I had to reflect upon myself, I'm like, okay, in the science area, I can still do that. I'm good enough to do that. I can do that here, but in this arena of my life, in the mathematical, where you found your level, Phil. That's where you are. You're good enough to get by on the fly at GCSE without even trying. But A-level, you actually have to, 1, listen, and then 2, study. And like, it's not a big dent to my ego, but I've always been, this can't be right. And I had to learn, I had to accept I'm not good enough in this area. And so what I did was, in them areas that I struggled with, and not struggled, I actually had to just try and study and have discipline. That was the thing that I didn't have that I needed to improve on. And then I got by. I was a teenage boy, so I'd done the minimum standard, but I got by, but I had to learn that. And sometimes we feel not good enough because we're not right now. And maybe you're not good enough right now in an area, but maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay right now because God is calling you to improve for the benefit of other people. So where in your life do you not feel good enough? And really it's because you actually know you're not. I want to encourage you not to wallow in self-pity, but be like Moses and accept it and set out how you can improve to be better, to walk out the purposes of God in your life. And that can be everything from something really little and seemingly unimportant that sort of tugs on you emotionally, all the way up to the big things of being a parent and everything that goes with that. Which brings me on to my final and possibly hardest point of this not good enough thing, which is this. What about when you will never be good enough? What about in them areas when you will never be good? You don't just feel not good enough. You know and think and understand that you will never be good enough. And some of us might push back straight away against this. In our culture of saying everyone's great at everything all the time, you're acceptable with everything that you do, and you're just great the way you are good enough. But when it comes to us and God, you know, in Romans it says that no one is righteous. No, not one at all. All have fallen short of the glory of God. We all, in terms of our relationship with God and getting to heaven and being brilliant and salvation, God said really clearly, none of you are good enough and you never will be. That's what he said, effectively. None of you can't do it by works. You can't work your way there. You're not going to be good enough. That's why I've sent Jesus Christ to die for you. I've sent him to die for you because you're not good enough. I'm doing the work for you. And so we understand theologically there's areas of our life where we don't meet the standard. We're always going to fall short. And God comes along and makes up the difference. And we put our trust in Jesus Christ and our sins wiped away. And we have salvation through that. And we understand that. We get that. Or most of us get that. Some people still get caught up in trying to fight your way to heaven and do good works. And don't get me wrong, I believe when the Holy Spirit comes and dwells inside of us and we become more like Jesus, that we will do more good things. But it's birthed out of that relationship, not trying to earn it and earn our way to heaven. But what if we'll never be good enough? When I think about this for me, and I'll just use a practical thing. When I was 15, 16, I was a pretty good rugby player. And I went to Norfolk Trials, went to Eastern Counties, playing Eastern Counties level, which was a really good level of rugby. I enjoyed it at the county level. And I got to Eastern Counties level, and I kept up. I was picked in the team, and I was like, I'm good enough to be here. And sadly, I got injured, and actually it wasn't sad for me because I actually hated playing Eastern Counties because it was so intense, and it was all about the winning, and it was very political as well, and a lot to do with class at the time. And I think I was the only working class kid there. Like everyone else was turning up in their Range Rovers, and my mum in her 40-year-old Volkswagen Polo, being pulled by a horse. and maybe that's just part of how I felt, but I didn't actually enjoy it, and I got injured, and I was badly injured, and I was like, I can't play anymore, and so I just didn't ever go back to it. I thought I'll leave that. But part of me understood I was good enough for that, but I could see what was coming, because the next stage was England trials, and I was like, and it's funny, because I was like, that would be cool, but I knew just based on the cohort I was in, just in the Eastern Counties, I was making it, that's fine, but I ain't going any further. I've hit my ceiling. I know where my limit is. And I'm like, I knew I will never play for England. I'm never going to play for it unless they're really short, lots of injuries. But I accepted it. I got to a stage where I'm like, this is where I'm at. And I'm okay with that. And I actually went a bit below that because, again, I was a teenage boy and lazy, and I could coast here. And so I went and played where it was fun. And my point being is that I had to accept I'm not going to get to that level, and never will, and that's okay. And so often we put these dreams or things in our life that it's like, I don't feel good enough to do that thing. God, I don't feel good enough to do that relationship, that thing at work, in there, whatever it is. And it's like, well, that's okay. You're not good enough for that thing. And I think it's good to know the truth about our abilities, our strengths, our weaknesses, and to accept them when we will never be good enough. Because either it's too late, I could maybe go on to be, world heavyweight champion UFC guy, but it's a bit too late now, Phil, you're 40. Rewind the clock, if you'd done something different, maybe different life, but too late, or maybe it was never on the cards. You know the people. The ones who turn up at X Factor or American Idol or whatever, and you're like, yes, never. I know you think, but you is never. And we all, it's sad, but we laugh at them people sometimes. But part of that in us as well is we want them to understand what truth is. We want them to know you're not that. You've been told that, or you think that, but you're not that. And the quicker you accept that, and I'm not talking about squashing people's dreams and stuff like that, but I mean who just measurably will never be able to do that thing. We want them to understand because we actually know it's actually healthier for them. It's better for them to accept this thing, I'm not good enough, so they can actually do the thing that they're supposed to be doing. And yet when it comes to our life sometimes, with the things we're not good enough that we just dream to head towards, and you're not good enough and you never will be, and we struggle to find that sort of acceptance within us of just being like, okay, I'm not good enough for that thing now or ever. And years later, Moses was having some problem with the people again, and we're reading Numbers 20. We're going to finish here. I'm over time, I'm sorry. Numbers 20, verse 7 to 12, it says this: the Lord said to Moses, take your staff, because everyone was thirsty, and you and your brother, and gather the assembly together. Speak, it says this, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they will have it for their livestock to drink. And it says this in verse 9. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm, and he didn't speak to the rock like he was told to. Previously, he'd been told to strike a rock, but he didn't. He was told to speak to the rock. But he struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. And it says in verse 12, but the Lord said to Moses, and this must have stung Moses and Aaron. He said, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me, and we think that's because you didn't trust that the action I've told you to do of speaking, or maybe it's because years earlier they didn't go into the land with the 12 spies and you didn't trust in me then, and God's had that card in his back pocket the whole time. I don't know. But he says, because you didn't trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, check this, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them. For years, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to the promised land. And God said, right, all of these things you've done, I've given you chance after chance after chance. I've bared with all these people, and not just Moses. He talked about the whole of the population who were in that group of people. It was only Caleb and Joshua and the people who were with them who said we can take the land, who ended up going into the promised land. God's like, none of you are going. And Moses, he said it directly to him, you ain't going. And what he was saying is, in the chances I've given you and everything, you ain't good enough. I need my people to go over here, and I need the leader, Joshua, to do the things I'm telling him to do. And at the minute, you're not good enough. And this must have been a big deal to Moses. It must have stung. But what I love about Moses is he didn't wallow in self-pity. It's not recorded that he stormed off or went and killed his brother, like Cain and Abel. Like, oh, I'm not good enough, so I'm going to, yeah. He went away, and he carried on, and eventually passed the baton to Joshua, or the baton for you Americans. And he'd done it in a positive way and prayed over them. And he accepted that this is not on the cards for me. But he made the most of the cards that had been dealt for him. And maybe in some areas, just in some areas, we need to accept that we will never be good enough. To accept that in some areas, we will never be good enough. And it's hard, but when it's true, we must accept it to move on, like emotionally from it. We need to accept it to move on emotionally from it and be free. Free to do what? Free to actually pursue the thing that God's wanting us to pursue and be called to, rather than putting our focus on something that will never happen. And so in the context of what I'm talking about here, sometimes, like Moses, we miss it. We miss an opportunity, we fall short, we've done something that's ruined something, and we can never make up for it. It's never going to be the same again. But sometimes we can make it. We fall short, we're not good enough if we improve. But sometimes I want you to think about this, sometimes we were never made for it in the first place. Sometimes, like, God's like, what are you doing? I've designed you, I'm calling you to this, and you're so focused on the area that you're not good enough in, that you're trying to prove it to dad or mum or teacher or whoever, your own self, your ego. You're trying to chase something you will never get, and you're missing out on the thing that I'm calling you to do because you're so consumed with feeling not good enough about something. And so sometimes we were never made for it. God didn't design us for that thing. That's why you're not good enough at it, because he didn't design you for that thing. And so we need to discern the difference. And I finished with this point that we need to discern the difference between these things. Because it could have been easier for me to give you a message of just saying, you are good enough. And you go away thinking, yeah, I'm good enough. But that's only one piece of this jigsaw puzzle. We need to discern the difference. We need to sort the wheat from the chaff. And pray for the Holy Spirit to help us discern and have wisdom and discern between all these three things. Because Moses had all of them. And sometimes I'd argue all at the same time in different areas. And so maybe in some way you feel not good enough. And maybe that's true, and maybe that's okay. And you need to move on. Or maybe that's true and you need to be like Moses and actually improve to thrive. Or maybe you do just to accept, like when God first called Moses into his purpose. That's just how you feel. And in fact, I am good enough. Amen? Let's pray.